Thank you very much for being here. I would like to thank especially Florian and Christian for making this possible. For me, it's a true pleasure to be here to talk to you. And it's also a pleasure to meet Professor Michael Geist in person because I was telling him, his works were so important for me when I wrote my PhD thesis in Brazil about copyright. So I couldn't be happier today, including the snow, because believe it or not, it's the first time I see snow in my life. So, yeah, I know it may sound strange for you, but it's the first time I see real snow in my life. So, including the snow, I'm happy also for that. I will talk about a little bit the regulation of internet in Brazil, and for this I divided my presentation into two parts. In the first part, I will talk about the making of the law and why this law is important. And on the second part, I will talk about the freedom of expression in Brazil and how it is regulated for the moment. So let's start with the first part. This is a Brazilian top model. She's very famous in Brazil. Her name is Daniela Sicarelli. She used to have a TV program, and she's a top model. So as you can see, she's a beautiful woman, known in Brazil, etc. Some years ago, around 2006, she was married to Ronaldo, the football player. I know people in Canada are not very great fans of soccer, but perhaps you might have heard about him because he was a very famous Brazilian soccer player. And he also won the World Cup in 2002. He also made Brazil lose the World Cup in 1998 to France, but let's forget this episode. Let's stay with the winning part in 2002. And by the time, 2006, Ronaldo was a player in a Spanish club, Real Madrid. So, he was famous in Spain, and he was married to Daniela Sicarelli, the Brazilian top model. I'm telling you that because this has absolutely everything to do with Brazilian internet regulation. Their marriage didn't last much. In fact, it took much longer to organize the marriage than the marriage lasted itself. So after some months of marriage, they divorced. But it was right after she had a new boyfriend, and they went in September 2006 to a beach in the south of Spain. And you know, she's young, the boyfriend was so young, they had been dating for a little, so it was a sunny day, a hot day, south of Spain. They were on the beach, and they felt the heat of the sun, the heat of the youth, and they had some very intimate moments on the beach. Because of that, a video was produced, because there was a Spanish guy recording those moments. If you watch the video, you will see that they are in a public beach on a sunny day with people around them. It's not a private beach hidden from everybody. It was a public beach, sunny day full of people. This Spanish guy recorded those images and he produced a video. The video was uploaded to many Brazilian websites, and it became a huge success. It was such a huge success that we're talking about 10 years ago, so Brazil didn't have the broadband it has now. And I'm not saying that the broadband Brazil has now is good, but it's better than it was 10 years ago. But because our broadband was not close to being good 10 years ago, street vendors sold the video on the street to make sure that everybody who was interested could have access to the video. So this is only to make you understand the importance of this case. Of course, Daniela Sicarelli was not happy at all about the existence of the video because she had not consented with the use of her image under that circumstances. So she decided to sue YouTube. and Google, requesting the video to be taken down from the internet, removed from the internet. It was 10 years ago, beginning of 2007, and YouTube removed the video, has taken it down. But 5 minutes later, somebody uploaded the video again, and then the video was removed, and then somebody uploaded the video again. So it was proved that YouTube could not make the video be taken down for good, in definitive. So Daniela Scarelli decided to sue Google in a more strict way. She decided to ask the judge, if YouTube cannot take the video down, why shouldn't YouTube be taken down from Brazilian internet? The whole website. And the judge thought, yeah, why not? So YouTube was removed, taken down, the whole website, due to a judicial decision for 2 days. Of course, you can imagine what happened later, after the judge gave this decision. The whole civil society started complaining, and the judge, 2 days later, annulled his own decision. Said, no, this is not what I meant. Yes, this is exactly what he meant, if you read the decision. But somehow he annulled the decision. YouTube was accessible again. But when we were going through this situation, we realized that Brazil had a serious problem, because we didn't know who was responsible, liable, for those information being in the internet. I mean, was the Spanish guy who recorded? Was every user of YouTube who uploaded the video? It was YouTube who was responsible to take the video down, in definitive. Who was liable and responsible for that? At the same time, all of this was happening. This man, who by that time was a senator, he proposed to create a criminal law. It would be the first Brazilian law to regulate the internet, and it would be a criminal law. We all know that a criminal law is the last resource. When nothing else works, we go to penal law, to criminal law. And we didn't even know who was responsible or liable for uploading the video, so how could we send somebody to jail if we don't even know who is responsible for the video being there or not? It was that moment that I worked in a previous institution, not the Institute for Technology and Society. So other professors with whom I work, and I still work with them, we were having lunch, and Ronaldo, who is the CEO of our institute, he said, Brazil needs a civil law to regulate internet, not a criminal law. And this is when we had a partnership with the Ministry of Justice to develop a platform to create the discussion, to start a discussion in relation to the Brazilian regulation of the internet. This was the making of Marco Civil. We called Marco Civil the civil trade framework, the civil framework for Brazilian internet. The year was 2009, and we developed a platform with the Ministry of Justice, and the discussion would be in 2 phases. The first phase would be the discussion of principles, and the second phase would be the discussion of writing the law. In the first phase, principles discussed would be privacy, freedom of expression, right of access, liabilities, net neutrality, and governmental data. Those were the 6 principles we wanted to discuss. So in the first phase, the question was, how do you think anonymity should be addressed in the law? So should we have some kind of anonymity or not? Brazilian Constitution, I don't know if you know that, but Brazilian Constitution is very clear in forbidding anonymity. Anonymity is forbidden according to Brazilian Constitution. But how should we interpret that? Is there any level of anonymity what should be considered anonymity? So the first phase was discussing principles. The second phase was discussing the writing, because after the first phase, the Minister of Justice collected all information and comments and worked on the comments to draft the first text. After drafting the text was again on the platform, so people would discuss the writing and say, no, this is not clear, this is confusing, what you meant before is not reflected on the way the article was written. And on the second phase, not only on the second phase, but throughout the process, we had people from everywhere contributing. As long as you could read Portuguese, you could contribute. You can see here that Marcelo Thompson is also contributing. He's a Brazilian who lives now in Hong Kong, but his master's was here, and Professor Michael Geist knows Marcelo Thompson, and he also he was living in Hong Kong or London by the time, and he contributed a lot with this process from another country. There were three very controversial issues regarding the writing of the law. The first was freedom of expression, and I will talk a little bit more about that on the second part. The second one was net neutrality, because of course telecommunications company didn't want any net neutrality, or the least possible net neutrality of the law. But net neutrality was finally approved. When Marco Civil became a law, net neutrality is there. We still have to discuss to what extent. For example, if zero rating is in accordance with net neutrality rules, we don't have a final decision about that. But net neutrality is something protected under Brazilian law. And data protection, I think Cristiano is going to talk a little bit about data protection. The fact is that Marco Civil protects personal data, but we still don't have a Brazilian law regulating data, and we need it. Of course, that with the current Brazilian National Congress, I'd rather not have a law about data protection, because it would be the worst law possible regulating the subject. So let's wait for next election 2018 and hope for a better Congress than we have now. After the voting of Marco Civil was postponed 29 times, mostly because of net neutrality, on March 25th, 2 years ago, it finally became a law. It was passed, and of course it had to pass, because Brazil was about to host the following month an international event called Net Mundial. And after Edward Snowden saying that Brazilian president by the time, Dilma Rousseff, who you can see here, was object of United States spying by NSA, it would be a total shame that Brazil would host an international event, a huge international event, after Marco Civil being discussed for at least 5 years and not being approved by National Congress. That's why it was approved, and that's why the father and the mother of Marco Civil are Daniela Scarelli and Edward Snowden, as strange as it may seem. But they are the parents of Marco Civil. This leads me to the second part, in which I discuss a little bit freedom of expression. Marco Civil is full of principles. We follow the European continental tradition, so we make laws in Brazil. Marco Civil is not a very long law, 32 articles. For us it's okay, it's not very long, it's a short law. But the first 8 articles are about principles. Our first article talks about principles, and then freedom of expression, human rights, diversity, social purpose of the internet. Then other principles: freedom of expression, privacy, data protection, and neutrality. Then the objectives of the network, internet. Then economic, social, and cultural importance of the internet. Rights, private life, data protection, clear information about data use, and privacy. Why? Why so many principles? Because we believe that if we have a law full of principles, it will survive the passing of time. If we make laws full of rules, with more rules than principles, technology changes all the time, a lot, you know that. So 3, 4, 5 years later, it would be more difficult to apply Marco Civil. That's why it was very important to have all the first 8 articles dealing with principles. But let's go to freedom of expression itself. I will not show you many articles, but I need, because it's boring, I know, but I need to show you 2 articles so you will understand how Brazil regulates freedom of expression on the internet. The discussion was, if somebody publishes something on the internet and I don't like it, how do I make this person liable? Is it enough a notice asking for the taking down of the content? Or only a court order should be the way to make the content be removed? Notes and takedown or court order? Of course, notes and takedown is faster. I achieve my objective much faster. But it's also more insecure because it could lead to private censorship. I just tell the website, look, this is infringing my rights, my personality rights. The website is not a judge. They probably don't even know the law well, but they will probably take the content down because they don't want to become liable after receiving the notice. On the other hand, if I have a court order, it would be much slower because judges have lots of work. On the other hand, it will be safer because judges are supposed to know what violates the law and what doesn't. Brazil decided for the second option, court order. This is very funny because when the first draft of the law was proposed, the proposition was the notes and takedown. But everybody on civil society started saying this will lead to private censorship. And that's why the text was changed. Of course, we have the freedom of expression in the Constitution, but what does Marco Civil say about that? This is the moment I show you the article. It will not last long, okay, people? So, less than 1 minute, let's read it so you can understand. In order to ensure freedom of expression and to prevent censorship, you see it's said to prevent censorship. Internet application providers may only be held civilly liable for damage resulting from content generated by third parties if, after specific judicial order, the provider fails to take action to make the content identified as offensive, unavailable on its service by the stipulated deadline, subject to the technical limitations of its service and any legal provisions to the contrary. So the general rule is you need a court order to make the website liable. The website is free to remove the content if they want, but they will be liable only after they receive the court decision. But there are 2 exceptions for this general rule. The first one is this. This article will apply to violations of copyright and related rights only when specific legislation to that effect is adopted. Why? Why copyright is out of the general rule? I'll explain you. And the second exception is, in my opinion, evident. Internet application providers that make available content created by third parties will be secondarily liable for violations of privacy resulting from the disclosure without the participant's authorization of images, videos, and other material containing nudity or sexual acts of a private nature if, after receiving notice from the participant or the participant's legal representative, the internet application provider fails to take prompt action to remove the content from its service, subject to technical limitations of the service. Why? Because now we're talking about revenge porn, for example. You have a couple, boyfriend, girlfriend, they split, and one of them leaks information, personal information with nudity and sexual images from the partner. just to make the person ashamed. There is no public interest in keeping these images on the internet, and we need faster decisions. This is why a notice in this case would be enough. So we have the rule, no more texts, okay people? No more texts. So the rule is removal by court order, the exceptions, revenge porn, notes and takedown is enough, and copyright. But why copyright? It makes no sense. It does, because of history. History tells us why copyright is out of Marco Civil. At the same time that we were discussing Marco Civil in civil society, Brazilian copyright law was passing through a very similar procedure to change our law. Why? Because our law was passed in 1998 and it's a really bad law. I could stay here for the whole afternoon complaining and telling you why our law is bad, but I'll give you only 3 examples. If you want to copy the content of a CD to anywhere, your computer, your CD to a computer, to an iPod, to your iPhone, it's not allowed. If you want to present a movie in a classroom, in a public school, if you don't have an express authorization, it's not allowed. If a book is out of print and you want to make a private copy of the book for you to study, it's not allowed. So as you can see, it's a very strict, outdated copyright law. This is why we needed to have it changed. And the Ministry of Culture wanted the law to be changed. That's why it was discussed for many years in a very similar platform as Marco Civil. Here you can see we had almost 8,000 comments on the proposal to change the law. However, after President Lula ended his term as president and Dilma Rousseff was elected, she appointed as a new Minister of Culture a person who didn't want to change the law. And after so many complications in her government that ended up with her impeachment, nothing was made. Our law is still the same. And again, with this National Congress, I hope they don't touch copyright law because they can make it worse. So let's wait for next Congress. But this is why it is an exception in Marco Civil, because at that time everybody was expecting the law to be changed, so the law would have its own rule about freedom of expression and copyright on the internet. Finally, 2 more minutes just to mention something very serious that's happening in Brazil. Do you use WhatsApp here in Canada? Yeah? We use a lot in Brazil because text messages are very expensive in Brazil, so we use WhatsApp. We believe that over 100 million Brazilians, which is half of the population, uses WhatsApp on a daily basis. However, due to a misunderstanding of interpretation of Marco Civil, I'm not reading the articles to you, you can look for the articles later, I'll show you how. Some judges are blocking WhatsApp, the whole app, in the whole country. And this has happened at least 3 times. First time was in February 2015. Second time was in December 2015. This was dramatic for me because I had been invited to go to China for a congress. I was there for 4 days. And as you know, Google is blocked in China, Facebook is blocked in China. The only way I had to talk to my family and friends was WhatsApp. And one day I woke up and it was blocked. And I couldn't communicate with Brazil in any way. And something also very fun is that because I couldn't access Facebook for 4 days, when I left China, there were many messages from Facebook saying, "Where are you? What has been? Where have you been? Please come back. Access Facebook again. We still love you." I felt so loved by Facebook. And the last time was July this year. The 3 times the app was blocked, but a few hours later, a higher court annulled the decision, so that was available again. But this shows you how insecure is the regulation of Brazilian internet, although we have a law to regulate Brazilian internet. It's still highly insecure. This is why a new report from freedomhouse.org, which in Brazil, which in 2015, last year, appointed Brazil as a free country, now changed it, and Brazil is not a free country anymore. It's a partly free country regarding internet, mainly because this was released last week. Mainly because WhatsApp has been blocked, and there are many bills of law being discussed in the Congress to limit access to internet and to allow blocking content, etc. So we have to be very smart and very attentive in Brazil not to permit these things to happen. So I finish here. If you are interested in this subject, we published, it's online of course, we published this short book called Understanding Brazil's Internet Bill of Rights. You can find it on our website. If you go to itsreal.org, you can see there, and you go in publications, you will find this book. We have the whole law translated into English, and some short articles include one from Florian explaining the Brazil Bill of Rights. And I finish here also with the picture. Florian mentioned we have a view
from
of
the
the
office.
sea. This is the view from our office, and this is to see if you would feel willing to go to Brazil. We have a fellowship program, as Florian mentioned. We were lucky enough to have Florian last year as our fellow, and we invite you all to go there, visit us, and take a picture from our veranda, as we call it. So thank you very much again, Florian. Thank you. I'm at your disposal for questions. Thank you.
And from the other side of the office, you can see the crest.
It's true.
Yeah.
Well, not so close, of course, but you can see it.
Yeah. Good morning. I would like first to thank Florian for the invitation and say I'm very glad to be here and with you all. And I will try to use my time to present a lot less than Sergio, because it covered a long field and a very fast forward movement. But indeed, what I'm going to talk here today, that's a phrase from Tom Jobim, Girl from Ipanema. Do you know the guy?
Very famous Brazilian singer.
Yeah, and that's not a very... privacy is my subject from a long time, and it's one of the concerns of my doctoral thesis. That's why I'm working on here a little bit. I hope you get the chance to visit the veranda and then go to see the Cristo Redentor. From here we think it's smaller, but it's very big, okay? And you have the opportunity to go there and have a crappy pictures from the Cristo Redentor, as all everybody does, okay? And I'll give you, maybe you were kind of shocked, you don't have a data protection law in Brazil. Well, maybe there's something important for you to know when you go there, because I really suggest you to. It's the most beautiful city in the world. Well, I was born there anyway, but anyway, I think the same. But you have to know something about Brazil. Most of the Brazilian history is under dictatorships, is under authoritarian regimes. So, and that's a long time, from the Portuguese Empire to the Brazilian Empire, and then we had the old Republic, about 5 years were the Republic of the Sword, because it was those two generals were the presidents, not elected really. But we had after that a succession of oligarchs that wasn't really very Republican. So to suit the time when he got Getúlio Vargas, he was one of the dictators twice. He got the chance to get there twice. And so you can imagine that, well, it wasn't to see how history changed, right? Because today he's a dictator. Well, yeah, well, it was nice, so kind of good. If you look now, or look later, what we had, and we had 10 years of democracy, yes. And then another military dictatorship from 64 to 85, this period of time, and left many scars in Brazilian society, and many families like myself, my Brazilian mother and Canadian father had to leave Brazil under the threat of prison and torture, as many other Brazilians. And you can imagine if this affect or not our perception of privacy in Brazil. No. Well, let's say just after the end of the dictatorship period, we had our Brazilian federal constitution. Was the biggest gift from the last jurist generation, and they tried to draft a better society with very beautiful principles. And you can practice your Portuguese right now. But in their Article 5, we have many of these principles there, and in which, for example, they will say the inviolability of intimacy and private life, honor and image. That's the most important what we had for a long time in Brazil. That, and in the same constitution we have in Article 5, my favorite, the right to information. Everybody has the right to receive from public or institution information about your self-interest. And he also had this mechanism, this constitutional process we call habeas data. You know habeas corpus, right? So free the body, free the data, free the information. Well, wait, but we have all but don't we have their access to information? Why do we have something else here? Because, well, they're supposed to be different. First one was a general right to information, and the second one was a due process, how to get your information through justice in a fast-track way. So habeas data started a trend in South America and Latin America. Other countries followed the example. It was innovation from the Brazilian legal scenery, and it took 10 years, almost 10 years to get another law to detail the habeas data. But habeas data was this big hope that we could use this due process to get to the files of the National Service of Information, the feared National Service of Information that collected much Brazilian data in those files for the use against people, for prison, for torture, for assassination, for corruption, all the kind of bad stuff. Okay, and mostly the habeas data was just used for that. Not as much as we wanted, we suppose it. But habeas data, in fact, was supposed to be something bigger. Habeas data was supposed to be applied for legal personal data in databases. And in the constitution draft, we had expressly one provision of that. That information, we had the provision of sensible data and databases. but this never saw the light after the Constitution. And what we had, we lost much of the data in the National Information Services, intelligence services. We lost that. This kind of information. My parents, for example, had files and they never had the chance to see them because the files disappeared, right? And also habeas data was interpreted by tribunals, by the courts, by the new politicians that once were in prison, that once were exiled. You see, that's not very important. Let it be. Let's not discuss this time. Let's forget it. And we also lost this very useful, well, potentially useful instrument, legal instrument, habeas data. So, how do you do? How can we live in this sense? Well, you see, what the law that we use more before the Marco Civil was our Code of Consumer Defense and Protection. Yeah, the one that we use for our $1,000 iPads over there. Yeah, it costs that. Okay, an iMac will cost like $6,000 there. And if we don't have a provision for our citizens, we have our provision for consumers. Okay, because a consumer is more important than a citizen, right? So we have a provision for access to data that the enterprise, the companies may have on us. We have the right to, they need the consent for having our data. They have the obligation to correct the data. Well, you know the drill, but very limited. That was in the 90s, and then. Oh yeah, sorry. I put those photos, but don't feel so sad, okay? Yeah, I made in your honor. That's where's this?
I don't know.
Just a
This?
sec. Yeah.
It's so cloudy. I don't know where you
Yeah,
went.
it's so cloudy, right? That's not the Cocobado. That's the Bonjing.
I don't know. No.
Oh no. No. Yeah, I put this just to give you a hint, just to give a little vision what you are missing right now. So we have this law, deposit credit information law, that the first time we have the provision for sensible personal data in Brazil, that companies could not have information about our genetics, about our sexual orientation, about the political convictions, religion, because those information were not could not be stored for the companies by companies. And also we have new provisions about consent, and the information that would be stored should have a finality. You should have a reason to exist in according to this finality, right? And that well, you see, that's the law we used the most for a long time. And after that, of course, hey, wait, don't you have something other, bigger, stronger? Well, for many, our constitution is really the civil code. We call this new, okay, because the old one was from the beginning of the last century. So we still call it new, okay, new civil code. The civil code is a little bit longer law than Marco Civil, at 2,000 articles.
2000, yeah.
Yeah, so a little bit more. And we have one article. You mention private life should be protected, and guarded. And judges should do what they must to protect it. Okay, that's all. That's it. Sorry. But later we also had the information access law. I was working at the city hall by the time. I was the IT secretary of the city. I don't know why, a lawyer, but well, it was too much trouble, you know. That's the reason. And I remember when this law came, I had to explain to everybody that we have to open the data, have present transparency, you know. But what, we're going to expose our information, our intimacy, our private life? Well, that's the secretaries, right? Saying no, you can't show that. that's the crazy kid who's going to expose that. Us, okay. I have to live with that for a year, but it went well by then. But I'm still today the crazy kid, you know, older and crazy. I get it. So, and then finally, after 7 years of struggle, this guy is working over there. Very, very important work they did, and little guys like me everywhere in the country supporting the idea also and promoting the events supported. We have the Marco Civil, and my favorite, he expressed it very much better, I want to stop on that, but my favorite part is exactly that Marco Civil is applicable either if the company is in Brazil or not. Brazilians are using it, so it's applicable. Okay, you can use it. Wow, that's the fun part. That I never get bored with this law, because I never get bored what the judges can imagine how to use that. Okay, so that's why we have all this breaking news frequently, and for shocking some people like poor Florian. They say what? No, sometimes you go, what they did? Yeah, they did that. In Brazil, yeah, we can't do that. So. What about the Brazilian Data Protection Bill? Well, I'll say that. I put that for you, okay, Sérgio?
This is for me?
Yeah, because I agree with you totally. Florian has a good article written in Portuguese. Do you have this in English too, I think?
No.
No, just in Portuguese about this. Oh, you're gonna miss it. So, what about the Brazilian Data Protection Bill? Well, I studied this since my master degree. I was in Spain 2000. I was studying this. Propositions, let's change the habeas data from the was this bill from our senator from Ceará, Lúcio, and let's improve habeas data. No, let's make a bill, let's make a law just like the European law. Well, after many years and many propositions, we have a new standoff on this law. This law was sent to the Congress the day that our President Dilma was impeached. I have to say something to you. Don't get too much impressed, but in the last 90 years, only 5 Brazilian elected presidents ended their mandates. Okay? Only 5. 90 years. We have 5 elected presidents that ended their time on the office. Okay, so we have this new standoff, the most conservative Congress in since we started counting, this change of political context is really we have a new proposition, for example, to balance the law. Is to say, no, we're not going to control anything. You see, and that's a serious thing. Okay. So, and we are having an increasing surveillance state in Brazil. You can imagine that the investment we got from the World Cup and everything else helped a little bit on that, and it's getting, in fact, pretty dangerous over there for social movements that we keep in touch frequently. Even if I think we still have to live with the many data breaches that we are having more frequently. The city of São Paulo had 600,000 files leaked about health of citizens of São Paulo in last July. São Paulo State also had, but I won't still. I burned my time already. So just to say, I'm gonna end it. So, what will be the perspective? Well, the game is on. I would say that okay, we don't have a law. I also don't want a law in these conditions. Law is one instrument. The data protection law would be one instrument. We have other instruments. I don't know how we use it. What we're gonna do. I don't know if it's too late. Our data is already there. Brazilians' data is lost. But we have to find, the game is on, we have to find other ways to go and resist and see if we can do what we did with the Marco Civil. And to really finish, that's the city that's his city, and that's my hometown. If you ever want to visit that too, Fortaleza is not bad at all. Do you agree, Ronald? And I would like to thank you. Obrigado.
Okay, well, thanks. So I'm here to provide the Canadian content portion of this panel, and I'm sensitive to the time, and I want to ensure that there's an opportunity for questions and that people have a chance to go get some of this really good food before we get kicked out of the room. So I'll go fairly quick. We didn't actually plan anything in advance, but interestingly, Sergio's presentation and what I thought I would talk about actually parallel quite closely. My intention was and is to talk a little bit about the how Canadian policy in some of these areas has been developed, and then a little bit on the what. And it seems to me that there's a lot of similarities. Now, I've learned in the last hour or so that those similarities end with respect to the weather, the views, and the term expectancy of political leaders. But when it comes to some of the digital policy issues, it seems that we actually have a lot in common. And so the Canadian story around some of these issues are somewhat similar to the experience that you've had with Marco Seville. It doesn't track exactly the same, and I have to say that to see it described in this way as quite literally a crowdsourcing effort that originates out of a law school in cooperation with then government is truly remarkable. And certainly we haven't in Canada been able to achieve that, and certainly on the prior government that would have been, I think, somewhat unimaginable rather. With the current government, they're quite open, as I'm sure many of you know, to consultation, but even that, the extent to which that willingness to really go forward and crowdsource, in a sense, legislation, I don't think we're quite there yet. But where we are there is in the role that the public has played in the development of internet policy. And so I think it's interesting to see that around precisely the same time as the top model is on the beach in Spain, here in Canada, and that leading to the kinds of cases that you're talking about, here in Canada, the public becomes increasingly engaged on precisely the same sorts of issues that ultimately form Marco Seville. So if we think of copyright, for example, we did try to address it and did address it in 2012. Our government, as many of you may know, had been talking for a very long time about copyright reform under a great deal of pressure, largely from the United States to follow the US example. Those pressures haven't changed, but around the same time, 2007, 2008, we saw the public become more actively engaged. It did it in part through social media. Facebook was still early days at that point in time, and we were able to use social media like Facebook to bring together many people who were concerned about the direction that the government was moving in with respect to Canadian copyright law reform proposals. And the government, which actually was scheduled to table legislation, being the Conservative government, Jim Prentice, who just passed away, was the minister at the time. Prentice was about to table the legislation. The government actually pulls back. It's somewhat unprecedented. It stayed on the notice paper in Canada for about 6 months as the government waited, redrafted somewhat the legislation. They ultimately brought it forward, but as some of you will know, we went through a process of about 5 years after that, where the bill didn't go forward. We held a national consultation on copyright. The public became quite engaged. And the 2012 legislation that we ended up with was much closer, I think, to some of the concerns, or at least tried to address many of the kinds of concerns that the public had expressed. It doesn't mean it was perfect. It wasn't and isn't. But it was a dramatic change in terms of some of the substance based on that public engagement. I think the same is true with respect to some of the privacy, security, and lawful access issues. Some of you may well recall the successive efforts of Canadian governments, both conservative and liberal, to introduce lawful access legislation, which would go to questions around the ability for law enforcement to gain access to subscriber information without a warrant, requirements to implement interception capabilities within the network, and somewhat infamously, Vic Tays, the former public safety minister under the Conservatives, a day before that legislation was scheduled to be introduced, was criticized about it in the House, and his response, as many of you may remember, was that you could either side with us, with the government, or side with the child pornographers. A comment that spurred many to say that if that was the choice, they somewhat reluctantly might take the child pornographers, because the public spoke out really loudly in response to what Taze had done, using crowdsourcing type techniques. I think my recollection, and certainly my favorite example of that, was a Twitter effort that was genuinely grassroots, and it started with the hashtag #TellVicEverything. And the idea was that if the government was going to engage in new kinds of surveillance, you might as well just tell the government everything anyway. And so people started telling Vic Taze what they had for breakfast and those kinds of things, of course. But my favorite of all was someone who had said, hey Vic, I lost a copy of one of my emails yesterday, can I get your copy? Tell Vic everything, which was a really good way of illustrating the kinds of concerns that were coming up around surveillance. And as again, you may know, the government ultimately actually pulled back on that legislation and canceled it. They brought back new legislation, of course, but had removed some of the areas of concern there too. And the same is true around net neutrality, which, as you mentioned, proved to be the most controversial in the context of Marco Seville. But if we look at the history around net neutrality in Canada, and we have fairly strong net neutrality laws, at least as compared to some of the other countries, some other countries around the world. They're enforced by the CRTC. And the origins for some of the rules that we have start with groups like Open Media, the group that really got its origins as a civil society, digital civil society group around the issue of net neutrality, and became a very vocal force on that issue, and has since become active on other points, and even more recently on issues around net neutrality and zero rating. Those have been largely instigated by Ben Klass, who is a graduate student now at Carleton, and he started work on these issues while he was a grad student at the University of Manitoba. And it was Klass that literally on his own looked at what in one case Bell was doing, and argued that Bell's promotion of one of its media services violated the net neutrality rules, the ITMPs, and filed a complaint before the CRTC. I'm not sure that Klass realized that in filing that complaint it would be a case that would follow him all the way to the federal court, as the CRTC ultimately ruled largely consistently with Klass's complaint, but then Bell decided to appeal some of those cases, and ultimately some of the stuff goes to court, and Klass, along with other people who intervened in the case, found themselves named in a federal court case, and had to then seek out counsel to figure out what exactly all of this meant. So we've had, in Canada it seems to me, some really interesting parallels. Not exactly the same, but the role that the public has played in trying to help craft digital policy, all in precisely the same time frame, I think is really interesting to see. And perhaps it suggests that one of the things that we are seeing, regardless of the country, is that the public is increasingly aware of and concerned with what internet policies look like, and want to ensure that they have a voice in that. Now, I think that's going to be important, because we also ought to recognize that the current government is actively engaged right now in policy making in a whole series of areas that, in a sense, the next generation of internet policies are about to be developed. And so we're seeing that. I was in this room a few weeks ago for a panel on Canadian culture in a digital world where there has been talk of Netflix taxes and internet taxes and link taxes as some of the possible outcomes coming out of that CanCon consultation. It's a consultation that closes on Friday if you're interested in participating. We've got the government actively consulting on national security right now. That closes next week. And they have re-raised the same lawful access related issues that were the subject of the Vic Taze discussion, with the prospect of mandatory disclosure of subscriber information or new interception capabilities. We've had ongoing, and now it's going to run until January, consultations on trade policy, particularly the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Donald Trump effectively killed yesterday. So there's at least one good thing one can say about Trump, but far outweighed by the bad, quite clearly. But nevertheless, the TPP would appear to be dead. It can't take effect without the United States, and so it's not going to take effect. Which at least opens the door to Canada rethinking a little bit how it approaches trade policy and trade negotiations. And then there's copyright, which it feels like we just finished in 2012 with the copyright reform, but one of the so-called features in the legislation, I always thought it was a bit of a bug, was that every 5 years we would review the copyright law to see whether or not it's up to date or not. That 5-year period starts next year. And so right around this time is the expectation. November of 2017, the government will launch a new review of the Copyright Act, and it is very clear that many of the groups that didn't get everything that they wanted back in 2012 intend to use the 2017 process as a mechanism to try to do that. So we have a lot of parallels, but we also, I think, face some of the same kinds of questions and aren't going to wait for the next government. We got this government for several more years, and the hope, of course, is that it'll be a really good one when it comes to some of the sorts of these policies, but there is a role to play. Quickly and lastly, just a couple of words on the substance to highlight where there are parallels again. And I mean, it's notable that Brazil rejected that notice and takedown approach. In particular, we've done the same, for those that don't follow the issue closely. Notice and takedown, creature of US policy that they've successfully exported to a lot of countries, but we rejected it here in Canada as well. The system in Canada is one known as notice and notice. It has its own problems, at least in terms of how it has been implemented. But some of the same rationale around concerns that takedown systems without court oversight could well lead to private censorship, taking down without sort of that appropriate oversight and review are some of the same kinds of concerns that we've had here in Canada, which led to a policy that says, well, we don't take down without court involvement, although, of course, many sites will take down where that happens. And that's going to be tested, not just within the copyright context, but in the other one area that where we might see some similarities, and that's in website blocking. So we've heard already about app blocking and some of the website blocking that you've experienced. Here in Canada, the closest parallel we have is a law that's come out of the province of Quebec, which mandates blocking of online gaming sites. This originates out of the Quebec government being frustrated that its officially licensed online gaming service hasn't generated enough revenue because there is too much competition. So there are lots and lots of choices to gamble online, and not everybody's using Espace Jeu, which is the one that's licensed by the Quebec government. And so the solution that the government came up with is to say, let's try to eliminate the competition by requiring ISPs to block access to a whole list of sites that we will ask one of our agencies to generate. In a sense, block access to the competition in that way. They were warned that this violates any number of laws, both constitutional and otherwise, but have gone ahead with it. It hasn't taken, the law's been passed, it hasn't taken formal effect yet, but both the CRTC and some consumer groups have challenged both before the regulator and the government. But it really does call into question the prospect that you could have a government, in this case a provincial one, mandate that ISPs, under financial penalty if they fail to comply, required to block access to what are otherwise legal sites. So we also face some of these kind of blocking questions too, sometimes in fairly thorny areas. So that was fun.
Thank you very much. If there is like any question, we have 10 minutes.
So it's kind of related, but it's based on recent events. I don't know if everyone has heard about the vice president-elect going to the Hamilton musical show, and then afterwards Trump tweeting about it, and then you had the Trump supporters wanting to boycott it, but they accidentally directed their tweets at the Hamilton Theatre in Ontario. So with situations like that come up, like, I guess like just general question is, what could that little Hamilton Theatre that's innocent in all of this, what could they do, or do you think this speaks to kind of upcoming concerns with internet use and trolls and bots using Twitter? So it's just very wide open. I have to bring up the bots again.
You can start, of course.
I think it was, of course. Well, I would only say, I mean, I think it will become more of an issue when the President of the United States appears to be an internet troll. That these kinds of things are only going to increase, and I think some of the kinds of questions that are going to come up are pretty dramatic. I mean, in Trump's context, he didn't just tweet about Hamilton, but one of the Hamilton tweets that he did tweet, he deleted. So there were several of the tweets that then took on Saturday Night Live. But he decided, I don't know why, multiple days on the Hamilton show, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, he deleted one of them, which raises really interesting questions about presidential records and the fact that in less than 2 months he will not be able to, or at least legally would not be able to delete those kinds of messages. The role that these social messaging platforms or social platforms play in this universe has suddenly, I think, taken on obviously a much bigger import with respect to some of the fake news issues and I think a more serious examination of some of the consequences of what takes place online. And it's anybody's guess at this point in time, but when Mark Zuckerberg can shift in the span of 1 week from saying, I don't think it's an issue, to providing a long list of here's the things that we're working on, I think it's pretty clear that the pressure on these sites is going to increase pretty dramatically. And I think there's value there because I think we're only now starting to see, and it's a bit late, what some of the consequences of that can be. But at the same time, vesting that kind of power in Facebook or in Twitter raises its own series of concerns because many people are, I saw one piece I think just yesterday arguing that Facebook ought to play much more of an editorial role. I'm not so sure. I have concerns about fake news, but I've also got concerns about a private platform that has little, if any, algorithmic transparency beginning to decide what's fake and what isn't, and perhaps taking on that kind of editorial role. So we're just at the very start, I think, of finally beginning to grapple with it now that we've seen some of the consequences.
I agree with everything. No, I mean, I don't know the case, but I think I understand what you mentioned. And this is a real problem. In Brazil, we say that every week there is a new case of hate speech or troll or something that takes the media. And last week, for example, one of the most important TV programs, certainly on the most important TV channel in Brazil, it's a morning program. The woman who presents, she's very famous, and she had a poll, and she asked, if you were a doctor, and if you had to save a drug dealer, you see the kind of question, a drug dealer seriously injured, or a policeman only lightly injured, who would you save?
Would you treat?
Treat.
Yes.
This is a crazy question, and you cannot imagine what happened on Twitter after she asked the question, because many people wanted to kill her, saying, how come you want people to say that a drug dealer should be saved before a policeman? Other people were saying, look, this question is so stupid. Don't you realize you're just a stupid woman? But it will last only 1 week, because on the next week, something else will happen, and everything will come up again. So I think the problem is much more difficult to solve, and it will not be solved, I think, with internet regulation. I think it's much more have the conscience of what the internet is for, and discussing hate speech, and discussing media literacy, and discussing, I see, and I think it's so absurd, but I see graduated people with a highly educated background, spreading fake news on Facebook, and they're so obviously fake. How come somebody can do that? So I see the problem you mentioned, and this is very difficult to solve, but I don't see any solution coming from internet regulation, because it would, in my opinion, inevitably take us to censorship. But on the other hand, it's so unfair if you are the victim of many trolls and haters on the internet, because of course you will want to block them or to delete the content, whatever. But I think the solution is not related to regulation. It's related to something else. Did I answer you somehow? Because it's a difficult question.
Joel?
What are you most worried about Brazil freedom of expression in the future? And you see some parallels with Canada, that like potential parallels that could happen in Canada too, just with how easily WhatsApp could be closed down, let's say.
Well, I think the biggest problem in Brazil now is having a conservative government saying the rules. And, you know, well, you might know, several Brazilian politicians are going to prison. Like dozens of Brazilian politicians are going to prison. Some for good reasons, and some who should be in prison are not. So the whole procedure is controversial. But for sure, we have many Brazilian politicians, the majority of the Congress, for example, in favor of right to be forgotten, to save their own careers. The first bill of law proposed to regulate the right to be forgotten in Brazil was only one article saying anybody can demand any irrelevant or outdated information to be removed from the internet regarding no matter whom. Like, this is an information, it's an irrelevant information about him, so I will ask this information to be taken from the internet. This is scandalous. And this was proposed by a man who was the spokesperson for the Congress, and now he's arrested. He was the person who conducted the impeachment procedure, and after conducting the impeachment procedure, he lost his mandate and was arrested or something like that. So, was he arrested?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
You
No,
see-
so many people arrested, I can't keep track. And I just wanted to confirm. And now we
situation
see,
changed in each
Well,
15 minutes in Brazil.
yes, in this morning
We get
he was
bored.
arrested. So
You see, so
2 hours later, I don't know. But it's obvious their interest in regulating the right to be forgotten to save their own careers, political careers. And this is a huge concern relating to freedom of expression, because it's not made for the public, for the society. You have many hidden interests in this discussion, and we will have to live with that, at least for the next 2 years. And who knows? I think I'm very optimistic about everything, but not about that.
If I may add, I have a lot of friends in Brazil, and that's the thing, they are not optimistic, because when you say that you have to look for other alternatives other than the law because the law is not being upheld, or if it is, there's so many ways to go without having to follow it. A lot of my friends are, looking to move out of Brazil because they're discouraged, and I know that Brazilians, especially the younger generations, are very active and very outspoken. I know on Facebook, I know what's going to happen in Brazil before the news because my Brazilian friends share it. But there is a point now where they are so discouraged because although you've shared 8,000 comments, at the end of the day, people are still scared of the police. They're still scared of what they say on Facebook, and they're scared of even having access to services like WhatsApp because they never know. One day they have access and the other day they don't. And so to your comment when you say we have to look elsewhere, it's not kind of pessimistic, and I don't know, if you can't even look up to the law to defend basic rights, what do you have?
okay. What I can say is we had already terrible times before, and we were the faculty at the same time with another president, and a political situation that we could never imagine to have a law like Marco Civil. And we had to face it. We had to try to be, we didn't have the hope of having a law like that. But what we learned, and there is something that changed Brazil a lot, and that's why we have all this thing going on over there. If you think 12, 13 years ago, most of Brazilian people were poor. Now most are middle class, and we have the planes, the airports only with the elite of the country, and now you see populars going everywhere, and the planes are are full, and the elite is complaining, I can't fly with poor people, you see? And I see that we have going back to your question, the other one, I see some similarities, and I have some concerns about that also, and about Brazil and Canada. For example, Rio has this NASA-like room of control of the city, have many big screens, all the systems, all the data, hundreds of cameras, in systems integrated, and no data protection law for protection the data of people. And at the same time, and this big data project, experiments going on, sharing with the private sector, and we don't really know what's there. But wow, you see, we have consent. That's great, consent, we're gonna solve it all. And it's not. What I see here is also this saying, we're going back to talk about consent, about control and collecting data. But in many ways, it's already too late. We can't only really fight just the collection of data, but we have to fight what's being doing with the data. And in many ways, you can use law also. You have to use law. For me, I would like to use a creative use of data, best data, even if it was to bother some people, you see, and especially some judges, because even some judges over there, I'm very intelligent people I know, they're also in Facebook spreading fake news, you know, and that's a very common thing.
Very common.
Okay, and so I think yes, we have very motives for pessimism, but we have seen worse also.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we have to stop because there is a class after us, but please have some food and thank you
Otherwise
again for
they will
coming.
wait. So